Okay, so we're now in the next chapter on, and we're going to talk about dynamics of carbon. And this chapter starts with Lake Manoon in Cameroon. And this was a place where the bicarbonate equilibrium played into a serious tragedy, in a place where limnologists were, physical limnologists were called in to basically as a forensic team to solve a problem of mass death. So we'll use that as a hook to get you into this lecture. In this chapter, we talk about, chapter 13, we talk about the forms of carbon and transformations of carbon. And then I'll present a very general introduction to nutrient cycling, using redox as a way to understand the cycles that we're going to talk about. And then we'll specifically apply that general framework to the carbon cycle. And following that, we'll go through with the nitrogen cycle, the sulfur cycle, the iron, and then all the nutrient cycles. So the first point is the different forms of carbon. There's inorganic carbon, and this involves the bicarbonate equilibrium. And carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, and it makes up an ever-increasing portion of the atmosphere. That's about 400 parts per million right now and climbing. But as the CO2 dissolves in the water, it forms carbonic acid, which then goes through the bicarbonate equilibrium with bicarbonate and carbonate. And then there's a ton of different types of organic carbon, just millions of different compounds through evolution have been created. So here's the bicarbonate equilibrium. And even though, we talk about, we'll just talk about CO2 being the form, even though it almost instantly converts to this form. And one of the key factors of this is the pH of where the equilibrium sits. And so this is on this graph, on the y-axis, we have the proportion of total inorganic carbon. So if it's 1, essentially everything's in the form of CO2. If it's zero, then everything's in some other format. And we see that the hydrogen ion concentration is intimately involved with bicarbonate equilibrium. So what do you do if you are in elementary school and you want to do a science project where you simulate a volcano?
Baking soda and, yeah.
Baking soda and vinegar, right? So you add baking soda and vinegar. Baking soda is which format on this, a form of it's sodium, what? Bicarbonate, right? So it's over here, right? And the vinegar is an acid, so you add acid and it's forcing the equilibrium this way to CO2. So that rapid evolution of CO2 is what causes the foaming to go up. It's also important in soft drinks and champagne and beer. So beer, you basically have a fermentation, and that if you put it in a bottle just before the fermentation is done, there's a little bit of sugar left. The fermentation is driving the pH negative, pH down, so hydrogen ion concentration up, pushing the equilibrium over, so almost all the CO2 is in solution, but it's under pressure, right? So when you pop the top, it starts releasing. So if I was to take a beer or a soda and while it's still sealed and inject the base into it, what would happen when I opened it after it and shake it around a little bit, shake it real good, right? And then pop the top, what's going to happen? Explode, explode, a mess, explodes. You're wrong. I put a base in it.
Put something in
happened to the CO2? Where is the CO2 going to go? To the left or the right of this graph? The pressure is not there anymore. The pressure is due to the gas that's under high pressure. So all you do is you take the CO2 pressure away and it's flat. So you're going to have one of the sadder things in life is a flat beer, right? So you'd have flat beer. You'd inject it with the base, you'd shake it up. It'd be fun though, because if you could get a bunch of that champagne that they have right in the locker room of the World Series, and inject a little bit of base in each one of those, then they can do the shake up things and get ready to pop it on each other's face, and it would neutralize it all and then be very anticlimactic. And they'd probably kill you if they caught you after that little stunt. But yeah, so that's the bicarbonate equilibrium. So why is beer and soda acidic? That's why. Why will acid rain harm mollusks? Right. So they need calcium for their shells. They need to precipitate calcium onto their shells. Yeah, and acid precipitation, lakes of acid precipitation, you cannot get any snails or bivalves. It's globally important because as you increase the carbon dioxide in the ocean, it pushes the pH down as the CO2 comes in. It makes it more difficult for the equilibrium to basically hold coral shells. So the corals are endangered not only by increases in temperature, but the ocean is becoming more acidic because of increased CO2. And the last question on here is, why does acid rain cause less harm to aquatic organisms in areas dominated by limestone? Good, Aaron. Yeah, it affects the limestone first, right? So when we talk about our alkalinity, right, our alkalinity measurement, we'll go back up here. What our alkalinity measurement is doing is we're adding hydrogen ions. So what happens is this is a buffer. This solution is a buffer right here. And the more bicarbonate there is in solution, the more acid it takes to convert it over. So you'll add acid and the pH will stay constant, and then all of a sudden it'll drop to 4, 4.5. That's our, I can't remember exactly what the pH sensor we have, but if you can figure out how much volume of acid it takes to decrease the pH, you'll know how much buffering there is, and you can calculate the alkalinity, the amount of bicarbonate that's dissolved in the water. So that is a practical thing that will happen in the lab that we'll talk about. And then you can use alkalinity to do things like calculate photosynthetic rate if you wanted, or the resistance to acid rain. Okay, so I promised I'd talk about death and destruction. And this is the Lake Nyos disaster. I'm sorry, I had the wrong one. I said Lake Manoon, but that was a different lake. This is Lake Nyos. So in 1986, some people woke up and they had basically been passed out. And they then looked around and found 1,700 people that had died and all the livestock that had died around this lake. Somebody that survived it reported a 25-meter high water surge out of that lake and the odor of rotten eggs, sulfide. And this was caused by a catastrophic release of supersaturated carbon dioxide from the hypolimnion. So volcanic activity is continuously feeding dissolved carbon dioxide into the hypolimnion. The epilimnion is essentially sealing it up, just like the top on a can of soda, sealing it up so you can get high concentration of CO2 dissolved in that hypolimnetic water until something happened. And they think it was probably a landslide that did, or maybe there's some cool weather. If there was cool weather, it would have broken the stratification, right? Because you don't have much of a temperature differential in tropical lakes we've talked about, because it doesn't take much of a temperature difference to cause stratification. Then you don't have to drop the temperature much to equalize it and allow for mixing, right? Or the landslide just physically caused the seiche, which then started it going. Once it started to release, it was just like releasing, a can of soda. Opening a can of soda, if you shook it up and it was warm, right? It just shot out. It shot out of there. And that's what caused this 25-meter high water surge. It was like it pushed all the water up along the edges. It was a calm evening, and carbon dioxide is more dense than other gases in the atmosphere. So it sat down in there. So basically, these people were asphyxiated because it displaced all the oxygen, and they got carbon dioxide. Just that's all they could get. So it was, and then, you know, they flew limnologists in to sort of talk about what the effects were of this. Well, one of the worries is that it's building up again, that they started measuring it, and that it's building up again. So they actually came up with a pretty clever solution to dealing with this. So we can see here how they do it. There's on the bottom is an example of them of how they put a floating pipe down to the bottom of the hypolimnion. So the supersaturated, there's a French limnologist figured this out, the supersaturated CO2 water, and they just start a pump to pull that water up. Well, as the pressure decreases, right, that CO2 can come out of solution. So it starts bubbling out of solution. So once the bubbles start forming, they're going to rise to the surface. They actually push the water up. So once you start the thing going, as long as there's supersaturated CO2 down here, it'll just keep shooting water out of it and pump itself out by itself. So this is here's an example from 1995, and there's a boat there. There's actually a boat with people in it down there. So you can see how high this is, you know, 50 feet high fountain of water that's caused by this thing shooting out. So yes, so it's like a permanent champagne bottle, like if you had an endless giant champagne bottle and a little straw in it, then it just keeps shooting out over time. So you can see that, look how high that is. And then they could put a bunch of those in this lake and continuously relieve that pressure with very little energy input. I mean, it's a cheap solution, but a really cool mechanical solution to the problem. So it's likely this is not going to happen again. Similar things have happened in other volcanic lakes, Lake Manun, as I said, in Africa, but also some of the Icelandic lakes have had similar kinds of things, and there have been mortalities of livestock related to those as well. Probably won't ever happen around here, at least, but it is a good way to illustrate the bicarbonate equilibrium and how it can be important to some people in some places. Now we'll switch from inorganic carbon equilibrium to the organic carbon. And we can think about dissolved and particulate. So remember, dissolved or particulate is based on filter size usually. There we can think about coarse particulate organic material and fine particulate organic material. So fine particulate organic material is, again, arbitrary, but you know, it's fine sort of sediments, particles floating around. Coarse might be leaves or sticks or logs. That's, you know, or even organisms. You know, even a fish is coarse organic material, particulate organic material. We can also think about biochemical oxygen demand, and this is really important because if you dump a bunch of carbon, organic carbon, into a river or a lake, the microbes will respire it and convert take away all the oxygen and cause suffocation of everything else. And so sewage treatment plants, we've gone through this a little bit already in lab, are treating for biochemical oxygen demand, so they don't release all this organic carbon into the river and cause it to go anoxic and kill the fish. So that's another way that we measure the total amount of organic carbon. We basically put it in a bottle and measure how much oxygen disappears from it over time. There are also a number of compounds that are really important because they are relatively resistant to degradation. And these are the structural materials in plants, tannins and lignins in particular. And they evolved to basically cause structure to occur, but also to stop herbivory. And then when these terrestrial plants die, this material works its way into rivers and streams. And it reacts, it gets broken down to some degree, but becomes more and more recalcitrant, and you get this organic material that is called humic material, resulting from the breakdown of plant material. And this is based on on several different fractions. You can soluble in alkaline and precipitating acid, the humic acids, the fulvic acid, soluble in acid, and the humans you can't extract with either or. These are really important in terms of the organic carbon that we find in rivers and lakes and how available it is. And we'll talk about this when we get to the ecosystem level because it can really drive some systems.